The heat in the Coachella Valley doesn't just sit on you, it vibrates. For Sarah and Alyssa, the first 2 days were a neon-soaked blur of freedom. They were 26, finally financially stable enough to afford the fairy tale world they had promised each other since college. The Airbnb was a mid-century modern dream in Palm Springs. White walls, polished concrete floors, and floor-to-ceiling glass doors that looked out into the vast, indifferent desert. "It feels like we're the only people left on Earth," Alyssa said, dropping her bags on the concrete floor. The sound echoed, a sharp thud that seemed to linger a second too long. Sarah smiled, but she felt a prickle at the back of her neck. The house was beautiful, yes, but it was exposed. The glass doors had no curtains, only thin mesh screens. To the west, the San Jacinto Mountains looked like jagged teeth against the purple sunset. To the east, there was nothing but scrub brush and silence. That night, the transition from festival fun to subtle dread began. They had decided to save their party favors for the final day, but the exhaustion of the desert was already setting in. Around 2 a.m., Sarah woke up. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the AC. Then she heard it. Thump. It was a dull, heavy sound against the exterior wall near the headboard of her bed. She froze, her breath hitching. In the desert, sound travels. It could be a coyote, a shifting branch, or the house settling after a 100-degree day. But this sounded intentional. She rolled over and looked through the gap in the bedroom door toward the living area. The moon was so bright it turned the concrete floors into a silver lake. Everything was still. "It's just the wind," she whispered to herself. The next morning, the feeling of being watched intensified at the festival grounds. The fairy tale world was starting to fray at the edges. While Alyssa was dancing to a synth pop set, Sarah turned around to grab a water bottle. 20 feet away, standing perfectly still amidst a sea of moving bodies, was a man. He didn't fit. He wore heavy black work boots and a dark, sweat-stained shirt. His hair was scruffy, his face shadowed by a week's worth of stubble. He wasn't looking at the stage. He wasn't looking at the art installations. He was looking directly at Sarah. Not with a smile, not with a look of recognition, just a flat, predatory stare. "Hey, let's move closer to the front," Sarah said, grabbing Alyssa's arm. Her palms were suddenly sweating. "Are you okay? You look like you saw a ghost," Alyssa laughed, her pupils already wide with the excitement of the day. I think I've seen that guy 4 times today, the one in the black shirt." Alyssa glanced back, but the crowd shifted. The man was gone. "Sarah, there are 80,000 people here. Everyone looks like someone else. You're just overstimulated. Drink some water." But Sarah knew. The way he stood, shoulders square, unblinking, wasn't the posture of a fan. It was the posture of a hunter. As the sun began to set on the 3rd day, they finally took the molly. Sarah hoped the chemical euphoria would wash away the paranoia. At first, it worked. The world turned into a kaleidoscope of golden light and humming bass. The music felt like it was moving through her bones. "I get it now!" Sarah shouted over the music, feeling lighter than air. But then the hour mark hit. The peak didn't bring joy. It brought a horrifying clarity. She turned her head to the left. Near a drink stand, 50 yards away, black shirt, black boots. She turned to the right. Near the VIP fence, black shirt, black boots. The man was moving with them. He wasn't following. He was herding them. "Alyssa," Sarah choked out, her jaw tightening as the drug's side effects began to warp her senses. "He's here, right there." "Who?" Alyssa asked, spinning around. "The man! Look!" Sarah pointed, but her finger was shaking. Suddenly, the music felt too loud. The lights began to squiggle, turning into jagged neon snakes that crawled across her vision. The faces of the people around her melted into distorted masks. And then the crowd parted. The man in the black boots walked straight towards her. He wasn't dancing, he wasn't smiling. He was walking with a purpose that felt like a death sentence. "You look really good," a voice whispered. It was right in her ear, though the man was still 5 feet away. Or was he? The Molly was fracturing her reality. "Are you here with anyone?" Sarah spun around, looking for Alyssa. Alyssa was gone. The sea of people had swallowed her friend, leaving Sarah alone in the dark, vibrating desert with a man whose boots were covered in the same red dust as the Airbnb's driveway.
The air felt like static. Sarah's vision was a fractured mess. The neon stage lights were stretching into long, glowing claws that scratched at the dark sky. She was peeking, but there was no euphoria, only a cold, metallic terror. "I can help you find her," the man said. His voice was calm, unnervingly steady against the thumping bass of the EDM stage. He stood too close. Sarah could smell him, stale cigarettes and the metallic scent of old sweat. He didn't look like a festival goer. He looked like a mechanic who had just stepped out of a nightmare. "No," Sarah choked out. Her tongue felt heavy, like a piece of lead in her mouth. "No, I'm fine." She turned and pushed into the crowd. Every shoulder she bumped into felt like a wall closing in. She kept looking back. Every time the strobe light flashed, white, black, she saw him. He wasn't running. He was just walking, his eyes fixed on the back of her head, navigating the crowd with a predator's ease. She finally broke free into a patch of grass near the outer fence. She collapsed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her phone felt like a foreign object in her hand. She dialed Alyssa, once, twice, 10 times. Call failed. The desert towers were choked with data. When Alyssa finally appeared, 15 minutes later, she looked like an angel emerging from a fog, but the relief was short-lived. "We have to go, now." Sarah gripped Alyssa's arm so hard her knuckles turned white. "Sarah, what's wrong? You're shaking." "He's here. He talked to me. We have to leave." The walk to the Uber lot felt like miles. Sarah kept spinning around, her eyes darting to every shadow. She saw black boots everywhere. She saw scruffy facial hair in every passing face. By the time they reached the Airbnb, the sun was long gone, and the desert wind was howling through the palm trees. The house, which had seemed like a modern sanctuary, now looked like a glass cage. "Lock everything," Sarah whispered as they stepped onto the concrete floors. I did, Alyssa said, trying to stay calm. "It's the Molly, Sarah. It's just a bad trip. You're safe here." Sarah didn't feel safe. She felt exposed. The floor-to-ceiling glass doors reflected their own terrified faces back at them. But beyond the glass, the desert was a void of pure black. Anyone could be standing 3 inches away on the other side of that glass, and they wouldn't know until it was too late. Exhaustion finally crushed her. Sarah crawled into her bed, leaving the door cracked so she could see the light from the hallway. She drifted into a restless, chemical sleep where the squiggle of the lights turned into the man's fingers. Creak. Sarah's eyes snapped open. The room was freezing. The AC was humming, but beneath that hum there was a new sound, the sound of weight shifting on wood. She looked at the doorway. A silhouette stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, completely still. The man from the festival was standing in her bedroom. He wasn't moving toward her. He was just watching. In the dim light, she couldn't see his eyes, but she felt the weight of his gaze. It was the look of someone who had already won. Sarah opened her mouth, but for a second, no sound came out. Then a primal, jagged scream tore from her throat. She threw the covers over her head, shrinking into a ball, waiting for the impact, waiting for a hand to grab her. "Sarah! Sarah! What is it?" Alyssa burst into the room and flipped the light switch. The harsh LED bulb flooded the space. The doorway was empty. "He was there," Sarah sobbed, her body convulsing. "He was right there, Alyssa. He found us. There's nobody here. Look." Alyssa opened the closet, checked under the bed, her own voice trembling. "The front door is locked. The windows are shut. It was a hallucination, I promise." Sarah spent the rest of the night huddled in Alyssa's bed, the lights burning bright. They stayed awake until the sky turned a bruised gray. In the morning, the sun brought a false sense of security. Sarah felt hollow, her brain depleted of every happy chemical it possessed. Maybe she was right. Maybe it was just the drug. She walked out into the hallway to get a glass of water. She stopped at the edge of the living room. Near the front door, there was a trail of dark, dried mud. The prints were clear, heavy, wide soles, the tread of a work boot. The tracks started at the front door, which was still locked, and walked slowly down the hallway. They stopped exactly at Sarah's bedroom doorway. There, the mud was thicker, as if the person had stood in that spot for a long time. Then the prince turned around and walked back to the kitchen, disappearing near the sliding glass doors. Sarah didn't scream this time. She felt a cold, dead weight sink into her stomach. "Alyssa," Sarah said, her voice sounding like it was coming from underwater, "look at the floor." Alyssa walked over, her face turning ashen. She looked at the muddy prints, then at the locked door, then back at Sarah. "He was inside. He was watching me sleep." And then they noticed it. On the kitchen counter, next to the knife block, sat something that hadn't been there the night before. A single, dirty, black baseball hat.
2 months had passed. The dry heat of Palm Springs was replaced by the salty, humid air of San Diego. Sarah tried to convince herself that the man in the black boots was a ghost of her past, a singular nightmare tied to a bad decision in the desert. When her college friend, Valentina, invited her to her family's beach villa, Sarah's parents practically packed her bags for her. They thought she needed the ocean to wash away the PTSD. "The guest room is on the lower level," Valentina said, leading Sarah down a set of wooden stairs. "It's private, you have your own entrance, and that view, you can't beat it." The room was stunning. Huge glass windows faced the Pacific, and a set of exterior stairs led directly from the beach to the second-floor balcony. But as Sarah unpacked her toiletries, she noticed the locks on the glass door. They were simple latches, flimsy things that a strong wind could rattle. "Ready for the sunset?" Valentina popped her head in, glowing with a tan Sarah envied. "We need to get some shots for the gram. The lighting is perfect." They walked onto the sand. The beach was crowded with tourists, families, and surfers catching the last waves. Sarah held Valentina's phone, snapping photo after photo as the sun dipped low, turning the water into molten gold. "Let me see," Valentina cheered, grabbing the phone back. As they scrolled through the burst of 100 photos, Valentina's smile faltered. Sarah leaned in, and the blood drained from her face. In the background of the first 10 photos, 100 yards away, a figure stood near the pier. In the next 50, he was closer. By the final photo, he was standing just 20 feet behind Valentina, partially obscured by a beach umbrella. He was wearing a black hoodie, despite the 80-degree weather. He wasn't looking at the sunset. He was looking directly into the camera lens, directly at Sarah. Sarah spun around, scanning the crowd. "Val, look, right there!" But the spot was empty. There was only an abandoned sandcastle and a seagull picking at a wrapper. "It's just some creep in the background, Sarah," Sarah shrugged, though she looked unsettled. "The beach is full of weirdos. Don't let it ruin the vibe." But the vibe was already dead. That night, Valentina's friend held a bonfire. The fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows against the cliffs. Sarah stayed close to the light, feeling the familiar prickle of eyes on her back. Around midnight, her boss called to check on a project. She stepped away from the music, walking toward the shoreline where the water hissed against the sand. "Yeah, I'll be back Monday," Sarah said into the phone, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. Then she saw him. A black figure, darker than the night, stood perfectly still, 50 yards down the beach. He wasn't moving. He wasn't sitting by a fire. He was just a silhouette, watching her talk. "Sarah, you there?" her boss asked. "Yeah," she whispered, her heart beginning that familiar, frantic rhythm. "I have to go." She didn't tell Valentina. She didn't want to be the crazy friend again. But when it was time to leave and Valentina suggested walking back along the moonlit shore, Sarah snapped. "No, we're taking an Uber. You're drunk and I'm not walking out there." Back at the villa, Sarah couldn't bring herself to sleep in the isolated lower-level room. She dragged a pillow into Valentina's room upstairs. She fell into a fitful sleep, only to be woken at 3 a.m. by a sound that made her skin crawl. It was coming from the window, a rhythmic, deliberate tapping on the glass. Sarah sat up, her eyes wide. She looked toward the window that faced the exterior stairs. There, silhouetted against the moonlight, was the man in the black hoodie. He wasn't trying to break in. He was waving, a slow, mocking wave. Then he turned and ran up the stairs. Thump. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. Sarah scrambled out of bed, her lungs screaming for air. The door was locked. I saw Valentina lock it. She ran to the bedroom door and threw her entire weight against it, bracing her feet against the floorboards. On the other side of the wood, she heard it, the heavy, unmistakable tread of work boots on the hardwood. The handle turned, slow, deliberate. The person on the other side pushed. Sarah sobbed, pushing back with everything she had. She could hear him breathing, a calm, rhythmic sound that terrified her more than a growl ever could. Then the pressure stopped. Footsteps retreated. A moment later, the distant sound of the front door clicking shut. When the police arrived 5 minutes later, the house was empty. But as they searched Valentina's room, a sharp scream pierced the air. "My clothes!" Valentina gasped, standing by her open closet. "My bathing suits! They're gone!" The officer stood in the corner, pointing a flashlight at the ceiling. "Miss, you might want to see this." Tucked into the corner of the molding, barely visible, was a tiny pin-sized hole. Inside was a wireless lens. He hadn't been trying to get in to kill them. He had already been in, and he had been watching them from the inside for days.
The house was a masterpiece of glass and concrete, sitting on a patch of sand where the city lights of Palm Springs faded into the vast black throat of the desert. Sarah's new partner, Mark, paced the perimeter of the pool. He was the man's man type, protective, skeptical, and convinced that a solid deadbolt and a sharp knife could solve any problem. "There's nothing out here for miles, Sarah," Mark said, looking out at the scrub brush. "No piers, no crowds, no boardwalks, just us." But Sarah had heard that before. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching the shadows of the Joshua trees stretch like skeletal hands across the yard. The Airbnb featured a small, corrugated metal shed near the back fence, meant for pool chemicals and extra lounge chairs. It sat in a blind spot, just out of reach of the main porch lights. The first night was unnervingly quiet. No thumps, no footsteps, just the wind whistling through the desert high ground. Night 2 changed everything. Around 1 a.m., the motion light near the pool snapped on. Sarah was already awake, her internal alarm system permanently set to high. She nudged Mark. "The light," she whispered. Mark groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Probably a coyote, babe." He stood up and squinted through the blinds. The light stayed on for exactly 30 seconds, then flickered off. 10 seconds later, the light on the other side of the house, the one near the shed, clicked on. "Okay, that's a weird coincidence," he watched, as the third light, the one furthest back by the desert fence, triggered. It was a path. Someone was walking a slow, deliberate circle around the house. "Stay here," Mark said. He went to the kitchen and grabbed a heavy chef's knife. Sarah tried to grab his arm, her heart hammering, but he shook her off. "I need to see who's messing with us." Sarah watched from the glass door as Mark stepped into the cool night air. The desert was a symphony of silence. Mark walked slowly toward the shed, the blade of the knife glinting in the moonlight. He followed a trail of footprints Sarah couldn't see from the window, deep, heavy indentations in the soft sand. He reached the shed. The metal doors were shut tight. The footprints led straight to the threshold and stopped. Mark stood there, 3 feet from the door, his chest heaving. He leaned his ear toward the metal. He expected to hear a struggle, a scuffle, or the sound of someone breaking a lock. Instead, a voice came from inside. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a growl. It was a calm, conversational tone, the voice of a man who sounded like he was sitting across a dinner table from a friend. "Excuse me," the voice said from behind the metal door. "Could you open the door, please?" Mark froze. The politeness of the request was the most terrifying part. It was the voice of the man from the festival, the voice of the man who had waved from the beach window. Then the man inside the shed let out a small, dry laugh. "Heh, heh." Mark didn't answer. He didn't demand the man come out. He turned and bolted. He slammed the sliding glass door and locked it with a force that threatened to shatter the pane. "Call 911, Mark gasped, his face the color of ash. "There's someone in there. He asked me to let him out." As Sarah dialed, they watched the backyard. The motion lights began to trigger again, but this time they were faster. Flash, flash, flash. Someone was running around the house, slapping the sensors, playing a game. The police took 20 minutes to arrive. By the time they opened the shed, it was empty. But they didn't find nothing. Inside the small, cramped space, they found a neat pile of empty water bottles, several wrappers from a specific brand of granola Sarah liked, and a small, handheld radio tuned to a dead frequency, static filling the air. "He's been living in here," the officer said, shining his light on the floor. "Probably since the day you checked in." Then the officer reached behind a stack of pool salt bags and pulled out a tattered, sweat-stained item. "Either of you own this?" He held up a black baseball hat, but this one wasn't just dirty. Stitched into the interior lining, in small, neat handwriting, was a date. It was the date Sarah had first arrived at Coachella 3 years ago.
Sarah moved into a high-rise apartment in the city, convinced that steel, concrete, and 24-hour security would be her salvation. She had the radio from the shed. The police had let her keep it after they found no usable prints. It was an old, battered thing, a relic from a different era. One night, unable to sleep, Sarah sat at her kitchen island and turned the dial. Static, hiss, pop. She remembered the officer saying it was tuned to a dead frequency, but as she slowly turned the knob, the static changed. It didn't become music or news. It became a rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. Sarah's breath hitched. It sounded like a heartbeat. She pressed the radio to her ear. Underneath the rhythmic thumping, there was a faint metallic scraping sound. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was the sound of a pencil on paper or a knife on a wall. Suddenly, a voice broke through the white noise. It was the same calm, conversational tone from the shed. "The 14th floor is much nicer than the desert, isn't it, Sarah?" Sarah dropped the radio. It clattered onto the floor, the batteries spilling out, but the voice continued for a fraction of a second before dying. Much more private. Her heart felt like it was going to burst through her chest. How? She had used a fake name for the lease. She had cleared her search history. She had stopped using social media. She walked to her front door and checked the peephole. The hallway was empty. But then she looked down. Pushed halfway under her door was a small white envelope. With trembling hands, she opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It wasn't a photo of her at the beach or the festival. It was a photo of her now, taken from the perspective of the building across the street. She was sitting at her kitchen island, holding the radio to her ear. On the back of the photo, written in neat, cramped script, were the words, "I like the way you listen." The stalker had changed tactics. He was no longer hiding in sheds or standing in doorways. He was a ghost in the machine, a shadow in the skyline. He was using the very technology she used to feel safe, to keep her under his thumb. Sarah called the police, but they were helpless. "He's across the street in a city of 10 million people, Sarah," the detective said. "Unless he breaks in, there's not much we can do. Draw your blinds." But Sarah knew drawing the blinds wouldn't stop him. She went back to the radio. She put the batteries back in and tuned it to that same dead frequency. Static, static. Then a new sound. It wasn't the man's voice. It was the sound of someone crying. Sarah froze. The crying sounded familiar. It was muffled, distant, as if the person were trapped in a box. She turned the volume up until the speakers crackled. "Hello?" Sarah whispered into the empty room. "Who is that?" The crying stopped instantly. There was a long silence, filled only by the hiss of the airwaves. Then a woman's voice whispered, so low Sarah almost missed it. "He's already inside, Sarah. Look at the vents." Sarah's eyes slowly traveled upward to the industrial-style air vent near the ceiling. The metal slats were dark, but as she stared, she saw a glint of something glass, the reflection of a lens. And then she heard the small, dry laugh, coming not from the radio, but from directly above her head.
Sarah scrambled back, her chair screeching against the floor. She stared at the vent. The glint was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow darkness. She didn't stay to investigate. She grabbed her keys and bolted to the elevators. As the doors slid shut, she saw a shadow flicker at the end of the hallway, too tall, too broad, and gone in a blink. She spent the night in a brightly lit 24-hour diner, the smell of grease and burnt coffee acting as her only anchor to reality. By dawn, she had a name. She had reached out to a contact in real estate who owed her a favor. "That building, the Skyline Lofts," the contact told her over the phone, "it wasn't always apartments, Sarah. Before the renovation in 2024, it was a data storage facility. They had miles of internal crawl spaces, service tunnels, and ventilation shafts built for high-capacity cooling." "The vents," Sarah whispered. "Exactly. When they converted it to residential, they didn't tear out the old infrastructure. They just built the apartment boxes inside the existing shell. There's a 3-foot gap between your ceiling and the floor above you. It's a hive, Sarah. A person who knows the blueprints could move through that entire building without ever stepping into a hallway." Sarah felt a wave of nausea. He wasn't just watching her from across the street. He was living in the walls of her own sanctuary. She went back to the apartment during the day, accompanied by a locksmith and a private security guard she had hired with the last of her savings. While the locksmith reinforced the door, Sarah sat on the floor with the old radio. She tuned it back to the frequency. The static was different now. It was no longer a heartbeat. It was a recording. Through the hiss, she heard a voice, not the man's. It was a woman's voice, Valentina's. "Why didn't we just walk back on the beach?" Valentina's voice asked through the static. Sarah's heart stopped. That was a private conversation from the San Diego trip. Then another clip, Alyssa laughing in the Palm Springs pool. Then the sound of Sarah herself crying in her bedroom at the Coachella Airbnb 3 years ago. The static wasn't noise, it was a library. He had been recording her for years, stitching together the sounds of her life into a horrifying audio diary. "I found something," the security guard called out from the walk-in closet. Sarah ran over. He was pointing a flashlight at the back wall of the closet. The baseboard had been neatly sawn through, but remained in place. He kicked it, and it fell inward, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel that smelled of dust and old sweat.
Taped to the inside of the tunnel was a small hand-drawn map. It wasn't a map of the city. It was a map of Sarah's life. It had lines connecting Coachella to San Diego to Palm Springs, all leading to a single point in the center, the Skyline Lofts, Unit 1402. But it was the note at the bottom that made Sarah's soul go cold. Suddenly, the radio in Sarah's hand flared to life with a deafening screech of feedback. The man's voice, now crystal clear and vibrating with a terrifying excitement, whispered, "The locksmith is almost finished, Sarah, but you forgot to check the bathroom mirror."
The bathroom was small, tiled in cold gray stone. The mirror was a large, frameless sheet of glass that took up half the wall. Sarah approached it, her breath fogging the surface. She looked at her reflection, hollow eyes, pale skin, a ghost of the girl who had gone to Coachella 3 years ago. She pressed her fingers against the glass. It didn't feel cold. It felt hollow. She grabbed a heavy glass candle jar from the counter and, with a surge of desperate adrenaline, slammed it into the corner of the mirror. The glass didn't shatter into shards. It spiderwebbed, peeling away in large laminated flakes. Behind the silver coating wasn't a wall. It was a second room. A secret chamber, no larger than a walk-in closet, was nestled behind the bathroom wall. It was filled with glowing monitors. Sarah's heart stopped. Every screen showed a different angle of her life. But it was the desk in the center of the room that turned her blood to ice. Sitting there was a high-end laptop, a professional microphone, and a stack of notebooks. Sarah stepped through the broken mirror, her boots crunching on the glass. She opened the top notebook. The handwriting was neat, cramped, and terrifyingly familiar. But it wasn't a diary of her movements. It was a script. The pages were titled The Deserter Watcher, a 10-part saga. She began to read, her eyes scanning the lines in horror. The mirage of safety, the Coachella sighting, the open door, the muddy footprints, the beachside shadow, the San Diego camera. Everything, every terrifying moment, every coincidence, every scream she had uttered over the last 3 years was written down in detail before it had happened. The man wasn't just a stalker, he was an author. He wasn't following a girl, he was directing a story. He had staged the mud in the desert. He had planted the radio in the shed. He had even timed the police response in San Diego to ensure Sarah would stay in character. "You're a natural, Sarah," the voice whispered. It wasn't coming from the radio. It wasn't coming from the vents. It was coming from the laptop speakers. A small red light on the built-in camera flickered to life. "Wait. Look at page 42, the man's voice urged, sounding genuinely proud. "That's where we are now." Sarah grabbed the notebook, flipping the pages. She found the entry for today's date. Sarah froze. She slowly turned back toward the broken mirror, looking out into the bathroom. The security guard was standing in the doorway. He wasn't looking for tunnels anymore. He was holding a small black remote. He didn't look like a guard. He looked like an actor waiting for his cue. "Scene 7 ends with a blackout," the guard said softly. He pressed the button on the remote. The lights in the apartment didn't just go out. The entire building seemed to groan as the power was cut. In the sudden, suffocating darkness of the windowless secret room, Sarah heard the crunch of glass. Someone was stepping through the mirror.
"You're doing great, Sarah. Don't break character now," a voice whispered. It wasn't the guard. It was him. A heavy, damp cloth was pressed against her face. The sweet, chemical sting of chloroform flooded her senses. The glowing monitors faded into streaks of light, and the world tilted until the floor became the ceiling. When she woke, the air was different. It wasn't the sterile, recycled air of the high-rise. It was dry, dusty, and smelled of sagebrush. She opened her eyes to a blinding overhead light. She was sitting in a director's chair. Her wrists were zip-tied to the armrests. "Welcome home," a man said. As her vision cleared, Sarah realized where she was. She wasn't in a basement or a dungeon. She was in a massive, abandoned film studio in the middle of the Mojave Desert. Around her, the sets were laid out like a twisted museum of her own trauma. To her left, a perfect recreation of the Coachella fence line. To her right, a facade of the San Diego beach house balcony. Behind her, the corrugated metal shed from Palm Springs. Standing in front of her was the man. Up close, he didn't look like a monster. He was thin, mid-40s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a scarf tucked into a designer jacket. He looked like a frustrated artist. "Who are you?" Sarah rasped, her throat feeling like it had been scrubbed with sandpaper. "I'm the man who made you famous," he smiled. "My name is Elias Thorne. I was a script doctor in Hollywood for 20 years. I wrote the scares for the movies you grew up watching. But the industry, they wanted safe, they wanted predictable. They didn't want real terror." He walked over to a camera mounted on a crane. "True horror isn't something you watch on a screen, Sarah. It's something you live. It's the 3-year slow burn. It's the muddy footprint you can't explain. It's the feeling that your life isn't your own." "You ruined my life for a movie!" Sarah screamed, her voice cracking. "Not a movie," he corrected, looking offended. "A masterpiece of immersive performance art. Everyone you met, the guard, the Uber driver in San Diego, even your chill boss, they were all on my payroll. They were extras, Sarah, background actors in the story of your undoing." He leaned in close, his eyes reflecting the studio lights. "But we're reaching the climax. Part 8 is where the protagonist meets the villain. Part 9 is the final girl chase. And Part 10, he paused, a dark shadow crossing his face. Part 10 is the one I haven't written yet, because in Part 10, only one of us stays on the set." Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, jagged piece of glass, a shard from the bathroom mirror. He placed it on the armrest, just inches from Sarah's bound hand. "The zip ties are loose enough if you try hard enough," Elias whispered, stepping back into the shadows. "I'm going to go turn on the exterior cameras. You have 3 minutes to decide if you want to be a victim or a star." The studio lights began to flicker and hum, a rhythmic sound that matched the heartbeat from the radio. "Action!" Elias called out from the darkness.
Sarah pressed her wrist against the armrest, her fingers trembling, and she gripped the shard of glass. She sliced upward. The plastic zip tie resisted, then snapped with a sharp crack. She was free, but she knew the cameras were watching. Every move she made was being framed, lit, and recorded. She stood up, her legs weak from the sedative. She looked at the sets. Elias had recreated her life with obsessive detail. But as she ran past the facade of the San Diego beach house, she saw it, a flaw. On the beach house stairs, there was a prop, a camera exactly like the one the police had found in the molding, but this one was labeled with a piece of tape, Actor Marker, Unit 4. Sarah realized then, Elias wasn't just a stalker, he was a micromanager. He was so obsessed with the visuals of the story that he had forgotten the reality of the people in it. He treated his actors like chess pieces, but he had treated Sarah like a prop. "I see you, Sarah." Elias's voice boomed through the studio speakers, distorted and godlike. Heading for the San Diego set? Classic. The protagonist seeks refuge in a place of previous trauma. Very final girl of you. Sarah didn't head for the exit. She headed for the Palm Springs shed. If Elias was following a script, he expected her to run for the big, heavy studio doors, the obvious escape. He had likely rigged them or had his actors waiting there. She ducked into the corrugated metal shed. Inside, it was a mirror image of the one from the desert, the empty water bottles, the granola wrappers, and the radio. She picked up the radio. It wasn't a prop. It was a functional two-way transmitter Elias used to cue his crew. "Elias," Sarah shouted into the radio, "you missed a plot hole." The speakers in the studio went silent. The rhythmic heartbeat hum stopped. "What did you say?" Elias's voice was no longer godlike. It was thin, coming through the handheld radio in her hand. "You wrote a script where I'm the victim, but you forgot one thing about the Palm Springs set. You told the police that the person in the shed had been living there since the day I checked in. You found water bottles and food wrappers." Yes, the attention to detail was perfect. "No," Sarah interrupted. "I'm allergic to those granola bars, Elias. I never would have had them in the house. You planted them to make a good scene, but you didn't actually know me. You only knew the character you created." Through the thin metal walls of the shed, she heard a door slam. Elias was coming. He was angry. He had insulted his art. "Characters don't talk back," Elias's voice echoed in the rafters. Sarah looked at the back of the shed. Unlike the real one, this was a stage prop. The back panel was held on by simple latches for camera access. She kicked the panel out and crawled into the dark void behind the sets, the unlit, unmonitored space where the scaffolding and wires lived. She wasn't in the movie anymore. She was behind the scenes. She saw Elias run into the light of the Palm Springs set, holding a heavy strobe light like a club. He swung it into the shed, screaming her name. He was frantic, his perfect climax ruined by a woman who refused to follow his stage directions. Sarah moved through the shadows of the scaffolding, silent as the ghost he had tried to make her. She found the main power trunk, a thick nest of cables feeding the entire studio. She didn't just want to escape, she wanted to cancel the show. She grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from a support beam. She didn't use it on Elias. She swung it with everything she had into the glass-encased power transformer. Crack! Boom! The studio didn't just go dark. Sparks showered the sets like dying stars. The fairy tale world of Coachella caught fire. The San Diego balcony began to melt. In the flickering orange glow of the growing fire, Sarah stepped out from the shadows. She wasn't running anymore. She was holding the heavy metal fire extinguisher, and she was walking towards the director. "The script is over, Elias. Let's talk about the ending."
Elias stood in the center of the burning ruins, the strobe light still gripped in his hand. The orange glow reflected off his glasses, hiding his eyes. He wasn't afraid of the fire. He was grieving the loss of his sets. "You've destroyed it," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The lighting was perfect, Sarah. The framing. We were making history." "You were making a cage," Sarah said, stepping over a burning piece of the Palm Springs fence. She held the fire extinguisher like a shield. "I'm not the girl from Coachella anymore. I'm the one who survived you." Elias lunged. He was faster than he looked, driven by a manic desperation to reclaim his final girl. He swung the heavy strobe light, the glass shattering against the metal of the fire extinguisher with a deafening clang. Sarah swung back, the heavy canister catching Elias in the ribs. He gasped, stumbling into the burning facade of the San Diego villa. The wooden stairs groaned and collapsed, pinning his legs beneath the weight of his own creation. Elias let out a jagged cry, reaching out toward the camera crane that was now being licked by flames. "Save the footage! The hard drives! They're in the shed!" Sarah stood over him, the heat of the fire searing her skin. She looked at the laptop in the secret room, now visible through the smoke. She didn't save the footage. She watched as the flames climbed the desk, melting the plastic and blackening the screen where the script lived. "It's over, Elias. No one is ever going to see your masterpiece." Elias began to laugh. It was the same dry, rhythmic laugh she had heard through the vents and the shed door, but this time it was filled with a terrifying pity. "You think I was the only audience, Sarah?" He coughed, the smoke turning his face gray. He pointed a trembling finger at the ceiling, not at the vents, but at the massive industrial skylights high above the studio floor. "I told you, I was a script doctor. I had a client, someone who wanted a real story. I was just the director, Sarah. I was working on commission." Sarah looked up. Through the glass of the skylights, she saw a row of figures. They weren't moving. They weren't helping. They were sitting in high-backed chairs, silhouetted against the desert moon, looking down into the burning studio as if it were a private theater. They were wearing the same black baseball hats. "The story doesn't end with me," Elias wheezed, as the roof began to buckle. "The audience, they've already paid for the sequel." Sarah didn't wait for him to finish. She turned and sprinted for the small service door she had seen behind the scaffolding. She burst through it, the cool desert air hitting her lungs like a miracle. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing into the sand a mile away. She watched from the darkness as the studio became a giant campfire in the middle of the Mojave. There were no sirens, no fire trucks. The desert remained silent. Eventually, the fire died down to a smolder. Sarah stood up, her body bruised and her mind fractured, but alive. She reached into her pocket and found her phone, the one she had managed to grab from the director's desk in the chaos. It buzzed in her hand. She looked at the screen. It was an anonymous message. No text, just an attachment. She opened it. It was a video file, recorded 30 seconds ago. It showed Sarah standing in the desert, looking back at the burning studio. The angle was from behind her, just a few feet away, hidden in the scrub brush. Below the video, a single line of text appeared.